And welcome. My name is Joe Davich, and I'm the Executive Director of the Georgia Center for the Book and a proud committee member of the Revival Lost Southern Voices Festival. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome you to the 2024 Lost Southern Voices Festival. And this is the session 2, the Lyrical South, Poetry, Blues, and Children's Literature. Today, we'll have several sessions, and please join us for the 3 p.m. session if you've not signed up already. A few notes before we begin our presentation. If you would like to use the closed captioning, you can find the CC button at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on your device. You can click that button, and then you can adjust the font size to make it more readable for you at home. I would also like to remind you, our moderator today is Alison Law, and she will tell you how to engage more with our panelists after the formal presentation has concluded. Alison is a self-proclaimed book evangelist and unapologetic author ally. She was involved in the planning and promoting of the first Lost Southern Voices Festival 8 years ago. She has served as the programming and media relations roles for the Decatur Book Festival, Alice Walker's 75th birthday celebration, and other literary events. She has developed and implemented marketing and PR campaigns for the New York Times best-selling novelists, historians, and journalists. Alison hosted Literary Atlanta podcast from 2017 to 2019. She has interviewed numerous writers in Zoom rooms, recording studios, and before live audiences at venues such as the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, the Atlanta History Center, and the Margaret Mitchell House. We hope you enjoy our presentation today and look forward to seeing you on the Zoom at 3 p.m. this afternoon and live and in person at the Decatur Library this coming Saturday. Once again, I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Alison Law. Alison?
Thank you so much, Joe. I really, really appreciate that warm welcome. And before I introduce today's presenters, I want to make sure that I extend another round of thanks to those who made this year's 8th Lost Southern Voices Festival possible. That includes the DeKalb Library Foundation, Georgia State University Perimeter College, and the Georgia Humanities, and of course, our exceptional partners at the Georgia Center for the Book. Yes, I was involved in the very first Lost Southern Voices Festival, and it is thanks to those partners and people who have put in so much hard work that it has evolved into such a stellar program. So thank you. Now, I am very pleased to introduce you to the presenters for the Lyrical South, Poetry, Blues, and Children's Literature. So I'm going to do my best to give these esteemed speakers their due. Our first speaker is Eli Arnold. Since 2017, he has served as the university librarian and director of the Philip Weltner Library at Oglethorpe University, where he manages all aspects of the library and archives. Previously a reference and instruction librarian at Oglethorpe, Eli began his career at the Horace W. Sturgis Library at Kennesaw State University. He earned his bachelor's degree in archaeology from Oglethorpe and a master's of library and information science from Valdosta State University. He chairs the Atlanta Regional Council for Higher Education and sits on the editorial board of the peer-reviewed Georgia Library Quarterly. Previously, he was treasurer of the Georgia Library Association. Eli presents and publishes locally, nationally, and internationally on information literacy, the role of archives and primary sources in library instruction, and in Oglethorpe University-related history. Our second speaker is Jim O'Loughlin. He is head of the Department of Languages and Literatures at the University of Northern Iowa. He's co-author with Julie Husband of the critical work, Daily Life in the Industrial United States, 1870 to 1900. He's also the author of the science fiction novel, The Cord from BHC Press, and the publisher of Final Thursday Press. And wrapping up today's panel is Aleshia Showen O'Neill. She's an assistant professor of English at the College of the Ozarks in Hollister, Missouri. Her dissertation, Charlie Mae Simon, Uncovering the Lost Voice of an Arkansas Author, was a culmination of primary and secondary research conducted at 4 special collections archives: the Butler Center of Arkansas Studies, John Gould Fletcher Charlie Mae Simon Photograph Collection, the University of Arkansas and Little Rock Center for Arkansas History and Culture, the University of Memphis Libraries, and Syracuse University in New York. She is the proud owner of a library that includes all of Charlie Mae Simon's published books and is actively involved in efforts to republish Simon's memoir and has some news to that effect. The memoir is called Straw in the Sun. So welcome, welcome. And Eli, we look forward to you kicking us off today. Oh, before you get started, I'm going to be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. Feel free to go ahead and communicate with me. I'll be managing that while our speakers are doing what they do best. Eli.
Okay, great. So I'm Eli Arnold, University Librarian at the Philip Waltner Library at Oglethorpe University here in Atlanta. For those that may not know, Oglethorpe is a small liberal arts and science college founded in 1835 in Milledgeville. And we've been in North Atlanta and Brookhaven since 1915. Today, I'll be speaking about Daniel Whitehead Hicky, Atlanta poet who was very prominent during his life, but has now been largely forgotten. Through this presentation, I hope to revive his memory and reignite interest in this lost voice. This will be my 3rd presentation at this conference, and I would like to thank everyone who was involved with the organization and logistics. I always like to start presentations with this quote by Zora Neale Hurston: "Research is formalized curiosity. It is poking and prying with a purpose." Hurston, like the authors we talk about today, was largely forgotten after her death. It was not until fellow writer Alice Walker rediscovered her that Hurston was rightly placed in the pantheon of Southern literature. I think she's a good patron saint for this conference. Now, my presentation. Don't ever let this happen again: the literary life of Daniel Whitehead Hicky. In 1975, while promoting his final collection of poetry, Daniel Whitehead Hicky, known to everyone as Jack, told this story to the Atlanta Constitution reporter Yolanda Gwynn. When he was in elementary school in Memphis, he wrote a poem titled Mother, which was chosen by the faculty to be published in his school's yearbook. Hicky's mom was super excited for him, but his father, less impressed, sent him a note that said, "Dear son, don't ever let this happen again." Luckily, Jack didn't listen to his father. Daniel Whitehead Hicky was born in Social Circle, Georgia on December 6, 1900 to Daniel H. Hicky and Elizabeth Eileen Whitehead. The Hicky side of the family had immigrated from Ireland in the mid-18th century to Louisiana. Hicky's father was the first to leave Louisiana when he moved to Walton County, Georgia. One of Hicky's great-great-grandfathers, James Mathers, served as the 4th mayor of New Orleans from 1807 to 1812. The Mathers family owned a large sugar plantation on the Mississippi River. Hicky's great-grandfather, Colonel Philip Hicky, served in the War of 1812 and was also in the sugar business, owning a mill. Through his maternal grandmother, Fanny, Hicky proved lineage and was accepted into the Sons of the American Revolution via Virginia Continental Army Colonel Charles Mann Thurston, who lost an arm at Perth Amboy in New Jersey in 1777. On his mother's side, Hicky's ancestors have been in Georgia since at least 1800. Hicky's maternal uncle, Charles Arthur Whitehead, was a very prominent Social Circle then Atlanta businessman in the cottonseed oil industry. Hicky's father would later get into this trade, and even Hicky would have a brief stint in the business. Hicky was the oldest of 4 children and the only son. His sisters were Elizabeth, 1902 to 1985, Margaret, 1904 to 1961, and Peggy, 1907 to 1979. Elizabeth, or Lubba, as she was called by her brother, married Carl Fries. Margaret Louise married William Bicknell, and Peggy married Theron Grant. He would be close with his sisters and their families his whole life. Again, Hicky was born in Social Circle, but his family moved with his family to Memphis by 1907. According to the Memphis City directories, Hicky's father worked for a variety of cottonseed oil companies, even owning his own, Daniel H. Hicky and Company, in at least the mid-1910s. But by 1916, his dad was listed as a cottonseed oil broker with another company. Interestingly, in the 1909 city directory, the Hickeys are listed with a home telephone number. At this time, only about 6% of Americans had a telephone, so we can assume that the cottonseed oil business was good. It appears that from 1917 until about 1918 or 1919, the family lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, where his father continued to work in cottonseed oil for Scott Brokerage and Commission Company. Hicky, who would have been around 18 years old at the time, is listed as a clerk with the General Electric Company. By 1920, the family had moved to Atlanta, and Hicky's dad was now working in banking. The city directory of the same year lists Hicky as the telegrapher with the Cotton Oil Company. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the directories list Hicky's occupation, in addition to telegrapher, as clerk, assistant manager, office manager, stenographer, and private secretary at various companies like Cotton Oil Company, Trust Company of Georgia, and Colonial Salt Company. Throughout this same period, Hicky lived with his family mostly in the West Midtown area, Juniper Street, St. Charles Avenue, 4th Street, Myrtle Street, and Euclid Avenue. Hicky's mother died in 1924 from breast cancer, and his father passed away after a heart attack 3 years later. Now only 26, Hicky leaned on his 3 sisters and their families. According to both the 1930 and 1940 census and a handful of Atlanta city directories during this period, Hicky lived with his sister Luba and her family. Hicky would later say that he left the cotton business in 1934 to focus on writing, and in the 1940 federal census, his occupation is recorded as author. But his poems were showing up in print around the country much earlier. He was featured in papers in Michigan, California, and Delaware in the 1920s. By the late 20s, Hicky was mentioned in many local newspaper society articles discussing the comings and goings of the Atlanta elite, as well as the activities of the Atlanta Writers Club. A quick aside to the Atlanta Writers Club. Founded in 1914, the Atlanta Writers Club started as, according to a centennial history, quote, a small group of writers and editors gathered to establish a social club for the advancement of literature and the promotion of the written word. Included in the membership were editors from the most read Atlanta papers, Journal, Constitution, and Georgian, local professors and other academics, journalists, playwrights, poets, novelists, and armchair authors. Still around today, the members quoted, quote, band together to share the camaraderie of literary fellowship, strengthen their professional connections, and explore avenues for expanding the reach of their publications. By 1927, Hicky was chairman of the Atlanta Writers Club Poetry Division and would serve as its president for 2 terms in 1929 and 1930. By the late 1930s, Hicky's poetry was regularly featured in the Atlanta Constitution, and during the summer of 1939, he became a regular weekly contributor to the Constitution's editorial page, along with folks like Ralph McGill, M. Ashby Jones, and Celestine Sibley. Hicky's column was titled As I Was Saying and included a short poem, then a short essay on an associated topic. As I Was Saying would run for over 300 weeks until early 1948. At the end of 1946, though, the column's format changed to a single poem by Hicky only, with no commentary or essay. His last full column on November 24, 1946, was very critical of what he saw as artists selling out. He wrote, quote, long, too long is the list of American artists who have swapped their exceptional talents for 30 pieces of silver, only to find themselves several years later representing only the ghost of a talent, to be peered at piteously through the windows of a shiny Rolls Royce. Let us earnestly hope that our writers and authors in the years which lie immediately ahead shall be less prone to fatten their purses at the expense of a brilliant American Renaissance. I can't prove that the demotion to a poems-only column was due to this editorializing on the business of art, but it seems odd that the one I found that is so brazenly critical of others is the last one published. In addition to the Atlanta Constitution, Hicky's poems were published in dozens of newspapers all over the country. He also showed up in literary journals such as the North American Review, American Mercury, Yale Review, and Saturday Review of Literature, in magazines like Saturday Evening Post, Harper's Bazaar, and Cosmo, and even in trade publications like the agricultural-focused Progressive Farmer and Bell Aircraft Corporation's magazine Bell Ringer, published throughout World War II. Hickey was also included in anthologies such as the 1937 Contemporary American Men Poets and in at least 10 volumes of Thomas Molt's yearly Best of annual series. In addition, Hickey published 6 books of poetry: Bright Harbor, 13 Sonnets for Georgia, Call Back the Spring, Wild Heron, and Never the Nightingale. And his last Poems of Daniel Whitehead Hickey, a compilation, was published in 1975, a year before his death. I wanted to quickly show 2 Atlanta Constitution articles that stood out to me from my research on Hickey. The top is a play-by-play of Hickey getting ready for the opera, published in 1950. The other, from 1952, is an article profiling Atlanta's most eligible bachelors. Hickey is listed, as is fellow poet Byron Herbert Reese, that we can see. Both were gay, but this was early 1950s, so they were just simply confirmed bachelors. Aside from being a writer and probably to pay the bills, Hickey worked for the US government, first as a civilian at Fort McPherson in the War Department Finance Office, maybe utilizing those clerk and stenographer skills from earlier in life, before enlisting in the Army in September of 1942. He would have been, of course, 41 years old, but he found a place in the Army Reserves and served until 1943. After the war, he would work as a public information officer or information specialist with the Department of Agriculture for over 2 decades in New York, Atlanta, and Washington. I've tried to piece together the timeline of where Hickey was when, through letters he wrote, newspaper articles, and city directories, but I haven't been able to nail down an exact timeline. I do know that Hickey was in Atlanta until 1954, in New York during 1955 and 56, and in Washington, D.C. from 57 until he retired from the USDA and permanently returned to Atlanta in the early 1970s. Blurbs, surely authored by himself, on the dust jackets of some of Hickey's books mention his extensive travel to places including Africa, Europe, the Middle East, South America, and the Caribbean. I was able to find a handful of records from 1934 to 38 for ships coming in from Bermuda, France, England, and the Netherlands, with Hickey listed as a passenger. I'm not sure where he traveled before he set back to America on these boats, and I'm not sure how he paid for the travel on a salary of a poet, since this was before he worked for the civil service. Not that that would have been extremely lucrative either. My next hunt is to cross-reference other passengers from Atlanta to see if I can link them to Hickey. But his poetry definitely reflects a world far outside of the rural and urban American South. Upon retirement and return to Atlanta, Hickey kept presenting his poetry at events throughout the South. In fact, just a month before he died, Hickey participated in the 16th annual Creative Writing and Communications Workshop of the Dixie Councils of Authors and Journalists at St. Simon's Island. In the spring of 1973, he gave a long interview with the Atlanta Journal and Constitution magazine. Waxing and waning over his life and career, Hickey was very blunt in criticizing modern poetry. He told the reporter, quote, "Current poetry has never been at a lower level. It's impossible to read or enjoy. There's no sense to it." He then called out fellow Atlantan and poet James Dickey, saying, quote, "I don't want to say anything about James Dickey. He's the one with the 2-page spread in the Atlantic this month, and it's no more poetry than I am a ballet dancer." Hickey died on July 17, 1976. The funeral was conducted by Christ the King's Cathedral, Monsignor John F. McDonough, and Hickey was buried in Atlanta's Westview Cemetery near his sister, Margaret, who had died in 1961. Later, when Sister Luba passed away in 1985, she would be buried close by. Peggy would be buried in Savannah, where she had moved, and both parents were laid to rest in Social Circle. Other than being widely published, Hickey was also highly awarded. In addition to many Atlanta Writers Club and Georgia Poetry Society honors, he tied for the Poetry Society of America's award for Best Poem of 1931 for Machines. 10 years later, in 1941, and most impressively, he was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize in Poetry for Wild Heron, published the previous year. Another honor of Hickey's is that Gone with the Wind author Margaret Mitchell so liked his poem A Letter from the Front, she would make copies and mail it to service members overseas who wrote and asked her if Georgia was really like it was in her book. 4 months after he died, Hickey was honored with a stone on the Author's Walk at Wren's Nest, Joel Chandler Harris's home and museum in West Atlanta. The stone was unveiled by Hickey's great-nephew, Dan Fries, who I was lucky enough to meet and talk with about Hickey during my research for this presentation. Hicky is remembered as a genteel gentleman, always with a jacket, often with a drink in his hand, speaking in an exacting and paced Southern drawl. Fondly, his great-nephew remembers road trips to Savannah and outings around Atlanta with his mother, grandmother, and uncle. I think the enduring quality of Hicky is that he wrote of the natural world with such beauty and longing that it stands the test of time. While his farm was very traditional, the way Hicky was able to paint a picture of a landscape and the feeling of home with words and phrases helped him endure for half a century during his life. Oak presentations like this can revive his memory and allow a new generation to experience his poetry. We at Oglethorpe are trying to help with this by digitizing 3 of his books that are in the public domain. Thanks to the work of our instructional technology librarian, Derek Otis, the books are now accessible through a simple search at archive.org. I want to end by sharing a little of Hicky's writing. In his April 7th, 1941, As I Was Saying column, Hicky pens a moral indictment of a small Florida town whose white residents mocked or ignored a crying Black woman trying to send a telegram to her husband with sad news. He begins, quote, "Several days ago, I was riding along a coastal highway. The ivory breath of blossoming orange groves permeated the air. Beside the road smoldered the sharp red fire of hibiscus. While the emerald leaves touched the hot blossoms, their tips seemed to be withered, shrunken, as the slow blue wind stirred them into motion. Great clusters of Queen Anne's lace swayed indolently in the morning sunlight. Bees were pirating their white, thin, spreading blossoms. Not far away, running beside the road a little piece back, the turbulent surf was pounding. The rising and the falling of the tide was in our ears. Gulls and pelicans drifted casually." Hicky ends with, "As we drove off, leaving the Black woman sitting there in the sultry afternoon sun with a small group of villagers about her, it suddenly occurred to me how really important the insignificant sum of 32 copper pennies could be to someone somewhere. Here was a Black boy dead in his piney woods cabin. Here was his old mother crying her heart out on a village street, beseeching all the populace for the loan of 32 cents so that she might telegraph his father the sad news, so that he might come home from Orlando and bury him in a shallow grave and put a newly split pine cross above it." Hicky, angry at the lack of empathy from the town, had given the woman the money to send the message. In 1951, Atlanta reviewer Harold Martin wrote of the release of Never the Nightingale, Hicky's first book since Wild Heron, which was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize, quote, "It is hard to say which of these new verses is most memorable. As a Georgian, Hicky writes of his native state with a feeling and perception unmatched since Sidney Lanier. Hicky is far more than a poet of Georgia. Today, the music of his verse is nationally known and nationally acclaimed." Martin then quotes South Carolina poet Arthur Rutledge, quote, "No living poet can match Mr. Hicky's magical qualities. His insight is infallible, his gift so rich, his touch so wild but unerring." I will end with the title poem from Wild Heron. "Lightly now, as lightly as a breath of wind breathes through the grass, softly, softly quieter than an opening lily stir, the heron, wings of folded white, treads the silence of the night. Through the waters of the dark flashing with a firefly's spark, by the fern bank sweet and close, palely as a dream he goes, spreads his young wings frail and thin to let the starlight drift within, folds them slowly back again, cool with starlight as with rain. Softly, softly through the night he wanders, white as snow is white, and when the last marsh shadow passes to let the sunrise light the grass, dawn will find him quietly, the secret blossom on a tree." Here are my sources, and I'd like to thank a couple folks. Anthony Von Loo is an archive assistant in the library at Oglethorpe who provide me invaluable research help. Derek Otis, as I mentioned, digitized 3 of Hicky's books. Noel Briscoe is a great personal friend and supporter of the OU library, and I used his personality file on Hicky to start my research. And finally, I would like to thank Hicky's niece-in-law, Florence Fries, his great nephew, Dan Fries, and great niece, Ellen Welch, for meeting with me and sharing stories and artifacts of their uncle. The title image of the beautiful oil pastel of Hicky is from Mr. Fries. I love hearing about lost voices. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or have a poet, author, or musician who you think could be revived. Thank you.
Eli, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. Jim is up next with his presentation, so just wanted to kind of say that you mentioned Byron Herbert Reese in your presentation, Eli, and we'll have to talk about him when we get to the discussion later, but he was another lost Southern voice. All right, Jim, you ready?
Okay, thank you very much. And thank everyone for coming out. I'm going to be probably introducing you to the Louisiana-born and Iowa-based blues guitarist, Eddie Bowles. So Eddie Bowles was born in 1884. Oops, second. There we go. In Louisiana, and was a full-time musician only when he was young. However, his formative years as a guitarist were spent in New Orleans during a period that was arguably the most important in American musical history, right at the birth of blues and jazz. Now, during his time as a working musician, Bowles spoke about playing alongside, learning from figures including Louis Armstrong and Kid Ory. And live music was then and now a feature of New Orleans, as Louis Armstrong was right of the city during this period. There were honky-tonks at every corner, and in each one of them, musical instruments of all kinds were played. And then before leaving the city, Bowles led 2 different dance bands. And this is, again, during a period before radio, prior to the appearance of the first blues recordings, when music meant live music. However, Eddie Bowles grew tired of his life as a traveling musician and felt he needed more stable work after he married his wife, Sarah, in 1911. That search for work led him in 1914 north to Cedar Falls, Iowa, where I live, and which Eddie described at the time as a city that was 99% Danish, which only a brief exaggeration, but in fact, Cedar Falls did have a Danish language newspaper until 1952. Bowles was employed to pave some of the original asphalt streets in the city, and friends arranged to bring his wife Sarah north and to set them up with a house. He and Sarah were among the first Black residents of the city, and Eddie would go on to be the first Black city employee. And all this is particularly notable because historical evidence strongly suggests that in the 1920s, Cedar Falls was a sundown town, and Eddie had to get kind of informal permission to live there. And on the bottom of the slide that you're looking at, you can see a line from a 1923 city directory that shows that non-white residents were being documented at this time. Now, Bowles held a wide range of jobs after arriving in Cedar Falls. As you can see there, he worked in a John Deere foundry for 22 years as a railroad foreman, was a woodcutter and a tree trimmer for the city, and then had his own business doing that. He was a cooper, a cook, factory worker, car mechanic, did a lot of things. But the one thing he did not do during his early years in Cedar Falls was to play guitar. In interviews, he said that he put the instrument down for almost 30 years before picking it up again. And that meant that when Eddie did resume playing guitar, mostly for himself, occasionally in public, he was playing this traditional fingerstyle technique that he had learned in New Orleans, and again was before even the guitar pick had been invented. And this all became significant because during the blues revival of the 1960s, Bowles was sought out by young guitarists eager to learn his unique picking style of traditional guitar playing. Often these were students at the University of Northern Iowa, where I now teach. He became a mentor to many younger musicians, including Rush Cleveland, a recent inductee into the Iowa Blues Hall of Fame. And in the 1970s, he was a featured performer at an annual folk convention. Now, remarkably, he continued playing well into his 90s before passing away at the age of 100 in 1984. And when Eddie Bowles was celebrated as a living legend towards the end of his life, that wasn't just due to his age, but due to his style of playing, which was representative of this earlier legendary moment. Eddie Bowles was happy to play guitar. He would set up an amp in his driveway just to see if people would stop by. He played impromptu afternoon concerts for neighborhood kids, but he was never interested in recording an album. That's not what music was to him. Again, as with the guitar pick, blues recordings didn't even exist when he learned to play. Nevertheless, during the 1970s and the 1980s, now when Eddie Bowles himself was in his 80s and 90s, musicologists, radio show hosts, and local historians took pains to get some of Eddie's music on tape. Now, until recently, the only recording of Eddie Bowles that was available was a single song on Art Rosenbaum's 2007 Grammy Award-winning collection, The Art of Field Recording. Rosenbaum had traveled to Cedar Falls and recorded Bowles in 1976. That session included Sterling Blues, which I tried to play for you at the beginning and did not work. I'll have to see how this works going forward. This had been the only Eddie Bowles recording previously released, although in the 80s, he'd made a series of appearances on Iowa Public Radio, and then at the age of 98, was interviewed and played on the then brand new cable public access TV show in Cedar Falls. And with tapes or recordings that were made of from all those things, I was able to compile from the archive enough recordings to make up Best of Eddie Bowles, a digital album that was released in 2022. And while there's a lot more I could say about the life of Eddie Bowles, be happy to talk about some of that. I want to at least try to return to his music and see if I can give this one more chance to give you a flavor of his work. And I'm going to try to play the song Bowles Blues, which was that song that appeared on the 2007 recording. I'll describe the beginning of it, and then we'll see if I can get it to work. And if I can't, I'll just have to talk about it. So as the song begins, singer wakes up to unexpectedly see his lover crying. And then when he tries to find out what's wrong, she replies, "I got the blues, sweet daddy, feel like going away." And when the singer hears this, he laments that he's broke. He can't help her to go anywhere, but he's misunderstood her, that her unhappiness is more existential, and the song takes a kind of darker turn from there. So let me see if I can quit out from what I was sharing.
This what you said to me. You don't need no money. Why I tend to go. I think I'm going to the river and jump over and drown. Well, she started to the river. She stopped and turned round and round. I was sitting there, baby, with my head hung down most to the ground. When she turned and started walking back to me, baby, I could go through the ground. I take me by the hand, walked away from where she was. I take me by the hand, Mama don't get them kind of blues no more. Ever since that baby, we never had no blues no more. I used to be them old people that sit down in them places and sing them blues. You sing a piece and say something, and somebody else say something, put something else in it. That's the way the blues was incorporated. That's right. You see, somebody, you go to saying something, yeah, so and so and so, and then fella, you stop all in here, and so, and that's the way. Now that's the way that went all the time.
I think that worked. Sorry about that. This is what I get for not coming early and testing on my own fault. So it's that clip from the song began, the second half of it you heard there, when the singer hears, "You don't need no money where I intend to go. I think I'm going to the river and jump over and drown." He realizes that he's misunderstood the entire situation. He's really kind of stunned by this and doesn't know what to do when she's walking away. And that leads up to the conclusion of the song. The singer isn't able to solve his lover's problem. In fact, his failure to be able to do anything for her is a source of shame. He says, I could go through the ground. All he's able to do is to sympathize with her and her unhappiness. He too has had the blues, and all he's able to offer is his hand, his company, and his identification with her pain. But sometimes, as in this case, that is enough. As the song ends, we never had no blues no more. Now, I realize that what I've done here is to read the lyrics of the song as if it was a modernist confessional poem, and Bowles himself cautions against such an understanding of his own work, as he goes on to account for in that discussion that was included at the end of the original field recording. Bowles describes his approaches to songs as developing from a blues tradition, which players build off of each other's ideas. You'd sing a piece and say something, someone else would say something and put something else in there. And that's the way the blues was. Then he pauses and says, incorporated. And that pause there, he's trying to find the right word to describe a complex creative process. But I want to argue that that creative process mirrors the kind of empathy that the lyrics had also noted. Eddie Bowles' blues weren't his alone. They built upon the ideas and experiences of others, and they portray an individual contributing to a kind of communal undertaking. Of course, that kind of approach also describes the thematic resolution at the end of the song. By recognizing and identifying with another's pain, the singer of the song is able to help, even if he himself doesn't have the means to solve the problem. It is, I would like to suggest, a performance of resilience. As critics have recognized, the blues in an ideological sense give voice to an experience of alienation, the feeling of estrangement that was a preoccupation of modernist literature and art in the 20th century. Blues music became a form identified with African American culture that allowed for the expression and validation of feelings of alienation. However, equally important, by working with the blues songs of others and by being part of a community, an artist like Eddie Bowles could discover that he was not alone in his feelings. Playing the blues for Eddie Bowles was not about sadness or depression, but about connection. And this was as true of his compositional process as it was in the role he played as a mentor to a generation of Iowa-based blues and folk guitarists. And it's one of the reasons why his work needs to be remembered and commemorated. Thank you.
Can't wait to talk about his unique contributions. Aleshia.
Hey,
You ready to set up and get
I
started?
I am. Can you hear me?
You sound great.
Okay, very good. My name is Aleshia O'Neill. I teach at the College of the Ozarks in Point Lookout, Missouri, near Hollister. It's a private college established in 1906, known for its work study program where students work and graduate debt-free. So I mention that because it's very unique to the author that I'm presenting on today, Charlie Mae Simon. She was an author from the Ozarks, homestead in the Ozarks. So that is significant for where we are now. I'm going to share my screen. So Charlie Mae Simon is one author that many people have not heard of in the United States. In Arkansas, she is someone who might be known because of the award that is given each year in the spring to new authors of fiction for middle school students. They vote, and then the Charlie Mae Simon Award is given. And yet, of her 29 books that she wrote, all of them are out of print. In fact, Straw in the Sun, that is the majority of my focus today, it was her memoir published in 1945, and it had 3 printings in that year. She was a member of the Penn Society, very prestigious, and yet she has slipped through the cracks of literary history, except for that single award. So the students who are voting on the award, they haven't even read any of Charlie Mae Simon's works because they're no longer in print. I became interested in her when I was working on my doctoral work at Arkansas State University in Jonesboro. I wanted to find the voice of a woman during the Depression that was not as well known. And just doing some random search, I found Charlie Mae Simon, and I'd never heard of her. So I purchased one of those discards, the library discards, and her memoir arrived in the mail. So Straw in the Sun, this is the copy I actually received. And when I opened it, let me begin. This is the paragraph I have up there. I'm going to read it out. Last spring, I went to Rocky Crossing again. New green grass was sprouting on the high ridge of the road that led there. And now and then there grew a persimmon shoot or a small hickory where a nut had fallen and opened deep in the untrampled earth. But the ruts made long ago by passing wagons were still there, guiding the wheels of our car through the dense forest, around the boulders, and between the tall trees. I was like a ghost returning to a place once loved. I wondered if ghosts, too, brought friends of their new existence with them, as I had wanted to do, and if they said with pride, as I am now saying, behind the house there was a rose garden with a lily pond where the wild iris grew. I'm going to flip over just a little ways because I want you to hear her prose. She's talking about the place that she carved in the wilderness. And what remained in returning to this homestead site years later after the cabin had burned down. Like an army of marching soldiers, the wilderness had come to the very border of my boundaries, and there it stopped. The growing trees stood close together and were so thick, even with their small new leaves of spring, that the path leading to the huckleberry patch was lost. One tree had broken rank, a red oak shoot that grew beside the moss rose. Through force of habit, I reached down to pull it out. The wilderness and I had made a bargain, which we both had kept, but we worked hard, each to make the other live up to his side. The home place with its barnyard and vegetable patch and rose garden was to be mine. All the rest of the 60 acres belonged to the forest. The roots of the trees had been like dragon's teeth, sending up 10 for each one cut down. I had pulled and chopped until finally they gave up and died, but only on my side of the fence. On the other side, the trees dropped new seeds every year, and pine and hickory and oak saplings came up to take the place of the old and dying ones. And she goes on in that chapter to talk about this homestead place. So having given that introduction, I want you to see, experience what I had when this library discard book arrived. Musty, smelled like one that needed to be removed from a library. And on the opening page is this inscription by Henry David Thoreau. I am startled that God can make me so rich with my own cheap stores. It needs but a few wisps of straw in the sun, some small words dropped, that has lain long silent in some book. And there was this element of, oh my goodness, this is exactly what I'm doing. I am opening a book that no one knows about anymore, and it's lain long silent. And I am going to be experiencing this voice that is lost to the world. So that is what began my search and honestly, my campaign. I'm a champion to find Charlie Mae Simon's books and to get them reprinted, available to those students who vote on their most favorite fiction book of the year. These are the seasons, pictures of Charlie Mae Simon through her life. And underneath it, you'll see, I think, part of what caused her name to disappear. Look at the number of names that she had attached to herself. Charlie Mae Hogue, that was her maiden name. Lowenstein, she married Walter Lowenstein out of Memphis. Simon, she married Howard Simon. And that was the pen name that she was known by, even though she would have preferred to have the last name of Hogue with her literary work. And then she married John Gould Fletcher, and that is how she was known the rest of her life. But in order to really understand Charlie Mae, we have to first of all look at her father. Charles Wayman Hogue is well known for writing his memoir, Back Yonder, an Ozark Chronicle. It was republished by the University of Arkansas Press. And it's about his homesteading in the same area that Charlie Mae Simon and her husband Howard moved in the years of the Depression in order to homestead when they were finding unemployment made it difficult for them to have the funds to live in New York City. And beside the back yonder, you see a picture of Charlie May in her early years with her older sister, Georgia. That's about 1899. Here's Walter Lowenstein, her first husband. They married in December 28th, 1920. The interesting thing there is mystery behind how they met, what their marriage involved. He's was a wealthy businessman, the mercantile business in Memphis, very well known. She was a young worker involved in political events in the Memphis area, but we don't know how they met. She did live at a boarding school, not boarding school, a boarding house for female workers that were coming in from the outskirts to work in Memphis. He was 40, she was young, and he died prematurely. So she was left with, I'm not exactly sure how the family did it, but an endowment and some kind of settlement as his wife, and used those funds to go to Paris to study art. And that is where she met Howard Simon, who is the illustrator of the beginning juvenile fiction that she did write. So following, like I said, following his death, Charlie May traveled to Paris to study art. There she met Howard Simon, who was 22. She was 27. 4 days after meeting her, he proposed. She was actually 29 at that time, 1926. Charlie May Hoag Lowenstein became Charlie May Simon. And that is when she acquired the pen name that she would be known by for all of her career. So in 1930, this couple, they'd come back to New York City. That's where Howard Simon was from. And he was not able to find work as an artist. That's understandable. And due to breadlines and other unemployment, there were just few options. So they decided to conduct an experiment, as they called it, and acquire a homestead, move back to Arkansas, in the land where her father's family had homesteaded, file a claim, and just wait out the Depression. And so that is what they did. Their experiment resulted in an experience in poverty when their bank that held the savings, which was most likely the savings from the Lowenstein family, when the bank failed and impoverished, Howard drew pictures for neighbors and woodcut drawings in exchange for food that would sustain them. Now, the interesting thing to me about her memoir and what I'm telling you here on her life, Howard Simon and Charlie May homesteaded together. They divorced when he went back. They both went back to New York City, and she decided, no, I want to live in Arkansas. I want to be back at the cabin. I want to be back near the roots of my family. So they did divorce. And they both wrote memoirs of the homesteading experience. And it's like they had an agreement. I won't mention you, and you don't mention me. So both of them, in their memoirs, it is an experience where they are alone with other people, neighbors that are coming to live with them. And yet we know factually that the ghost, like I was mentioning in the opening of the book, the ghost that we see through her memoir is Howard Simon, her husband, because we know he's there. And interestingly, her first published article mentions Howard and herself in their homesteading, and then the memoir itself, published in 1945, it does not. I'm getting ahead of myself, so I'm going to stick to my slides. Here are some examples of the illustrations that Howard accompanied her work with. Her first book, Lost Corner, and that's talking, actually her first book would have been Robin on the Mountain. That was also written during their homesteading. Lost Corner was their second. Then you had Popo's Miracle and Faraway Trail. And I'm just showing these to give you an idea of his talent, which was part of the reason that her publisher, John McCrae, did not want to find another illustrator, and also wanted her to keep Simon as her last name. That was what was established. Howard was very talented. He also became the illustrator for his second wife, Minnie Lewitton, and remained an illustrator of children's books in that way. So, although Howard suggested the enterprise, adjusting to homesteading life came more naturally to Charlie May than to her husband. And perhaps that's because she was returning to the land where her roots did run deep. Her family had homesteaded in the land, in the valley. Her grandfather, leaving the Civil War, had brought his family to the ridge that is across from the valley, across from the ridge that they did their homesteading on. But these are pictures of the land where they did the homesteading and also the cabin itself. And ironically, the pictures, especially that on the right, was taken by John Gould Fletcher on his visit. So the homestead itself, coming from Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and North Carolina, the settlers built their cabins first in the rich valleys. So that would have been where her grandfather settled. Rumors of war and other national events filtered slowly to their region. As the rich farmlands in the valleys disappeared, people went further up into the hills, into seclusion, and it was a lot more difficult to grow crops, to eke out a living in the hills of Ozarks. So there's a huge contrast in the homesteading experience, what she and Howard have compared to that of her own father and her grandfather. She had to walk one way to the Valley store weekly for mail and any kind of supplies. And that's where she would learn news of the community as well as the outside world. Imagine finding out weeks after the event that Japan had invaded Manchuria and the possibility of the United States joining a war, reaching her weeks after the event had occurred. And yet that Valley store, which was run by her uncle, that was the place that you went to get the news. Electricity was non-existent, radios very uncommon, and civilized life didn't often touch the hill people. In the memoir, when she is talking about civilization reaching the hill people, it's usually in a negative sense. Fences broken, the whiskey stills broken, people coming in and hunting on the land where the hill people were requiring the deer and other game that was available just to live. And so it wasn't seen as a positive thing when civilization entered the hill country. It was seen as an invasion and they were not welcome. I think the reason that Charlie May and Howard were welcomed was because she had family. So she wasn't an outsider. But in the Ozarks, in the hills at this time, it was very clannish. So as I mentioned, which I thought I had it with me and I do not, the magazine, Scribner's Magazine, in May 1933, while they were homesteading, she wrote an article calling, it was Retreat to the Land, an Experience in Poverty. And that was her first published work. And she writes about it in her memoir. In fact, I'm going to find that one and read it, even though I'm realizing I'm giving up some time for other things. But it's interesting to be able to piece these things together. When you work in the archival, finding things, the communications, it's just really interesting to see it appearing in her actual writing. Here's a letter for you too. This is her Uncle George talking from New York, and it's written on a typewriter. He waited for me to open it, curious to know what was in it. It was from an editor of the magazine that had an article I'd written and mailed that winter. And in it, there was a check. I'd not believed I would ever see as much money as the amount written on it. It was, I suppose, the minimum price paid for a first story. Perhaps even the editor thought that it was a small price to pay. But at the scale I had been living, spending less than $100 a year for all of us, it was enough to pay my debts and live a long time after. Yeah. So in the memoir, she does mention the article. In the article, Howard is along with her in the homesteading experience. It gives you the backdrop for what begins their experiment. They're in New York. They're having a conversation with other people who are unemployed, and they decide, hey, there's still land available in Arkansas. Why don't we just go do a homestead? And they were young and decided, okay, we'll do it. And this is the cabin that they built from timber that was on their plot. Here are more pictures of the cabin. That is Howard standing in front. Neighbors that were going by at the time of the visit, you can see them on the left there. Here is also a wagon that came by. Charlie May is the one holding a child. So these are neighbors, the welcoming party when, although look at the fellow on the left-hand picture. Recognize that either Adolphine or John Gould Fletcher was taking the picture, and he does not look like he is welcoming them to the community. They are outsiders. And this is, I'm going to go back to the other one. This is the Simon Homestead Land today, Homestead Land in the Ouachita National Forest. That's part of what's been difficult in getting it republished. Charlie May called this the Ozarks since then, even though it was known as the Ozarks. Even her father's book that was republished, it was in the Ozark Studies. Now it's seen as the Ouachita National, and so that's made it a little bit more difficult. Here is Rocky Crossing, where the wagons would go. And then this is John Gould Fletcher and Charlie May in front of the cabin. They intended to move back, live in the cabin after they had married. And the night before, they move in with all the new equipment, all of the furniture, everything. In a storm, lightning strike, and it burns to the ground. And that is how her memoir, sorry for the spoiler alert, ends. And she's immediately suspicious that it was arson, hidden, even though she doesn't come straight out, the meaning is inferred, hidden in the act of the storm because the Hill people saw Fletcher as an outsider, Fletcher as a wealthy man, family connections. And Charlie May, by bringing him there, was turning her back on the people. The other picture there is Charlie May at the picnic that was mentioned when I read from chapter 1, sitting there at the ruins of the homestead site with her husband. This was a publicity picture for Straw in the Sun when it was published. So after her divorce from Howard Simon, she does marry John Gould Fletcher, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning poet. That appears on every book published by Charlie May. Her credentials on the book flap. It's the time that she was living in. Her credentials were John Gould Fletcher, Pulitzer Prize winning poet. And her father, Wayman Hogue, Charles Wayman Hogue, who published Back Yonder. So they were married 14 years, and John Gould Fletcher's career was at a slide at this point. He was not able to find university positions as featured as their resident poet. And as he was on the decline, even though the Pulitzer Prize came after they were married, this is when her career had taken off, her writing career, and the 29 books that she did write. And his depression, severe depression, resulted eventually in him drowning himself in a very shallow pond near their home in 1950. But during this time, it was Charlie May Simon Fletcher, her writing, that provided the income for them to live on. Every year, she wrote a book that the children would be waiting to receive in the libraries. And E.P. Dutton and Company, they were her publisher through her entire career. So over the course of 3 decades, Charlie May Simon, the author, grew in popularity with children, teachers, and librarians across the country. Her regional tales, told with simplicity, struck a chord with boys and girls yearly. Each spring brought a new tale from their author. Here's a book signing in the 1930s, just showing some of the books, and children just crowded around her. You'd see her show up there with her pearls and her gloves. And these are children from the Ozarks, impoverished. She was a role model to them, showing them this is what you can do. You can become education, dream big, and they would gather around. This was a book signing that she did. So it's fascinating to me to see how her life changed after Fletcher's death, which was very unfortunate, but she never wrote again about fiction. She chose to write nonfiction biographies of humanitarians noted for peace. This one, Albert Schweitzer, she traveled to Africa in 1953, lived there and wrote the biography for Schweitzer. She was selected to write this biography. She spent 4 years in Japan while she was researching on the Crown Prince, teaching English at the university there. Here she is talking to Toyohiko Kagawa, who was also known for his work in establishing better living conditions in Japan, another book that she wrote. Shooting the Rapids, an elderly Charlie May shooting the rapids in Japan. And then here in 1961, Palm Sunday. But notice the book flap, her biography. This one is for Lonnie's Landing, the author of Song of Tomorrow, Straw in the Sun, and Lonnie's Landing has written so many books that most readers will know by now that she's a native of Arkansas, and then distinguished by the wife of distinguished poet, the daughter. And notice who gives the credentials here on this book flap. Her husband writes of her. The review goes to her husband. So part of the reason I believe that her name has disappeared and her voice is that she spent a majority of her life following his death, making sure that his voice remained, that his poetry remained, and did that at the expense of hers becoming silent. Here you see the University of Arkansas gave her an honorary doctorate following her awards that she received in her senior years. She was given the Schweitzer Award for the work that she had done, the biography of Schweitzer. And yeah, so in 1960, she receives the honorary degree. And then there you have her last passport picture, all of those years of traveling. And that was one where she actually wasn't able to use it. So here's what in Arkansas would be seen on the books, the Charlie May Simon Book Award. Some of the awards given, Gary Paulson, Beverly Cleary, all of these individuals, well-known, John Grisham, Lois Lowry. And in the early years of the award, she would attend the ceremonies where they were announced. And then it's just continued from 1971 until today. But I would say part of the reason that I did want to focus on Charlie May Simon is the fact that her biggest fans need the opportunity to be able to read her own work. And we do have exciting news. The University of Arkansas Press is reprinting Straw in the Sun. I'm really excited about that. I was just talking with the publisher early today, and they expect that to be by spring next year, possibly before. So look for the reprint and your chance to be able to read her beautiful prose.
That's such incredible news. Thank you, Aleshia.
Yes.
I want to invite Eli and Jim to come back and talk with us. We've had one question come in that I think we can apply to all three of the voices that you have shared with us today. And it is kind of that process, Aleshia, that you were talking about in your presentation of becoming a champion. For Jim, for restoring the voice that, you know, of a person who never thought of music as recording, but only live music. And then the beautiful naturalist poetry that we have for Jack, Eli. I'm wondering if you can, in the time that we have left, each of you take a turn and tell me a little bit about what the recovery process has been for your lost Southern voice. Eli, you want to start first?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's kind of exciting, you know, the kind of level of digitization. I still love going to physical archives, and I went to UGA and Emory and History Center to do the work on Hicky. But so much I think the digitization can sometimes be a plus and a minus because so much stuff is digitized that's, I think sometimes, at least with me, I fall down kind of the rabbit hole of research, and I'll spend an hour looking at issues of the Atlanta Journal that have been digitized on newspapers.com instead of like focusing and doing what exactly I need to do. But then you can find amazing things. I found an ad in I was able to tell the date of when Hicky went to New York because I found an ad he posted in the Atlanta Journal selling his refrigerator from his apartment. Because I was able to, I got his phone number from a city directory, and then I searched the newspaper for his phone number and found that in like the classifieds. So it's really neat, kind of the treasures you can find through the digitization. But I still love going to the archives and going through the boxes and finding something that maybe no one's ever touched before since it's been put in that collection. So I love it. That's my favorite part of preparing for things like this.
Jen?
Yeah, and I can just say that, I think the process of doing archival work for people that do it is, really, really compelling. And, like I was saying, we have no problem spending hours down a rabbit hole trying to search out one thing or another. The challenge, of course, becomes then that active, what we're all here for today, that active communicating it to others, finding people that can be as interested as you are. And in many cases, having to do that second step of the work, the research is not enough. It's also being able to bring those materials, make them available again in another way for a new generation of readers or listeners. That's a lot of work that sometimes takes funding.
Very true. I would say also going along with that, my dissertation work was on Charlie Mae Simon. So all of the archival, it was in the libraries of Little Rock, Memphis. Luckily, Syracuse, I didn't have to go there physically. That was digitized. But it's so fascinating to open it and find the voice, find the fears, the struggles that she was going through, the communication. This was fascinating. The communication from the publisher, all kept in her files. But what was really hard about that is that her voice wasn't there. I only had the side of E.P. Dutton. And then trying to infer meaning, oh, they mentioned that she had a meeting of the National League in her home in the 50s. And there was no record of that because I didn't have her original letter. That was really interesting piecing together. That was on the Memphis side. And then on the Little Rock side, at the Butler Center and at the other archival libraries that I went to, it was her voice. It was diaries. It was personal letters. And so with each one, I had a different angle, and that was really fascinating. But I did discover I had to make a personal connection with her. I went to the land where she did her homesteading. In those years, I just felt that someone who had championed for her husband should be remembered in Arkansas. And so I was probably a little bit more persistent than Arkansas, the University of Arkansas Press would even appreciate. But that's what it takes, is the persistent wheel and constantly saying, look, this is really important. Have you read this memoir? And these students that are voting and all they know is her name. Is this fair? So it's being the persistent champion and being willing to give that voice. And frankly, it's not about me or any of the introductions that I would give on her. It's about opening her voice back. And that's what I had to just decide, that this is what I will be doing. And it's paid off because they're also looking at doing some of the children's books. We're talking about Popo's Miracle. She was unique with the children's literature because she was presenting an angle from the side of those marginalized and trying to teach children there's no reason for the prejudice that exists. And her children were respectful and open and not marginalizing. And that's why I think they need to be brought back to our public.
I'm glad that you said that. You accidentally answered a question that just came in through the Q&A, Aleshia, about wondering if some of her children's or young adult books were going to go back.
Yes. We're hoping Popo's Miracle, that's one in particular, which is fascinating. She was writing about life in Mexico And it was at a time when so many migrant workers were coming into Arkansas and there was conflict. We know about some of the racial conflict that occurred in Arkansas, but she was showing, normalizing, and showing this is a different culture. This is beautiful. I mean, gorgeous pictures that are in that book. Look at, just beautiful, and showing the importance of looking out for other people and children having character traits that would then, when they become adults, they're going to have these kind of, hopefully, attitudes. I have friends in Arkansas who grew up reading her. I did not grow up in Arkansas. So it's interesting to get their perspective on the same idea, how she dealt with social issues in a kind way that dealt with character education before it was a buzzword.
All right. Okay, Allie, I want to check because I think we're right at time at 2:15. I did have one other question. Should we go ahead and take that one and then say our goodbyes for the afternoon? So Aleshia, yes, thank you. We heard in the presentation this morning about Lost, and one of the people that came up was overshadowed by another popular book or another popular author at the time. And that's something that certainly can resonate with all of our Lost Southern voices. But you've made some arguments about why you think that Charlie Mae Simon was lost. Do you think that Laura Ingalls Wilder and the Little House series may have had a role in that?
I think that's fascinating. And I was thinking of that honestly on the way to work today. Laura Ingalls Wilder had a champion. Think about it. Rose, she had a champion. Mansfield is just an hour away from where we are. We regularly take our students there. Charlie Mae did not. She didn't have children. Laura had Rose. Little House on the Prairie, the very first one, Little House in the Big Woods, came out the same year that Back Yonder did, which was Charles, her father's book. So I think that with Charlie Mae Simon, what happened, there were many very dominant male figures in her life that guided her career. And I think that her voice, even in her career and during her lifetime, was overwhelmed by these voices, and it didn't stay afterwards. She didn't have anyone advocating for herself, and very often she wasn't listened to.
Cool. And we had another question come in too. And I know, Eli, you started answering the question in the chat, talking about who were Hicky's influences. I had the same question.
Yes.
It's for someone who was so outspoken about what didn't qualify as poetry.
Right.
I wanted to know who the author of the Riches 695 poetry collection thought was worthy of enjoying.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And he kind of, unlike a lot of other poets in his time, he didn't do a lot of like reviews. I know a lot of the Atlanta poets would also do book reviews for the Constitution or the Journal, the Georgian. He didn't do a lot of that. And most of his collections that are in archives are other people that have kept letters that he wrote them. He did, I've been in touch with his family, and they have some stuff, but like most of his papers weren't kept, unfortunately, or made their way into archives. So you talked about Byron Herbert Reese. In Reese's collection at UGA, there's the letter that Hicky wrote him. Reese was supposed to come by and like have dinner with him, and just completely stood him up and didn't even like do anything. And like, he's having to write a letter to him back in North Georgia, because this was in, like 1940. But to some of his other friends, he would write he didn't really think Reese was a very good poet. And he would talk about that. So he was very opinionated about who weren't good poets. But I haven't really been able to find much about ones that he did like. Unfortunately, he didn't like a lot, but he kind of said it with that Southern charm, I think, that sometimes people in the South can get away with saying mean things, because he kind of had apparently this really good Southern drawl, So it sounded like he was being nice to them, even if he was cutting them down,
Yeah, if you don't have anything nice to say, come sit by me, huh?
Right.
And Jim, thank you for posting. I know that you posted a link earlier in the chat where people can, I'm going to copy and paste here. I am curious why Eddie moved, why Cedar Falls? Why did he migrate north to Cedar Falls?
Yeah, it remains a question. I mean, he was just following the work, led him, along the rail lines to Cedar Falls, and then he found, some people that were friends and were helping get other jobs when the road paving was done. But it is a kind of ongoing question. There is a larger Black community in our kind of sister city of Waterloo. He did not live there, and why, how that all worked out, being the only Black resident in town for long periods of time, not something he really spoke openly about. You really have to read between the lines.
Well, I'm glad that his path crossed with yours and your study of the blues. Thank you so much for bringing us these Lost Southern voices this afternoon. Thank you. Ali is a fantastic moderator. Please feel free to check out the resources that are in the chat and let us know what you think of the event this year. We're so happy to have you all in attendance. Have a good rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.